Yeah, and like I think Gitika was suggesting, if people come towards the front, it might be easier because there will be some people who come in like for the closing session. So evening, it's been a really intense and challenging few days, both in terms of length and depth and the range of the debate that we've seen. So I guess we're about to kind of try and wrap up and close and bring these 3 days to some kind of a conclusion. And I'll first introduce my colleagues in the panel and then maybe a few reflections. So first, towards my left is Professor Adrian Allen, an old friend, uh, originally from Argentina, spent many years now at the UCL at DPU in the UK, and has worked on a whole range of questions that I think many of us are deeply interested in, especially on questions of infrastructure. A major report that was produced a year and a half ago looking at the nature of cities and especially on the question of new urban science. And more recently, something that's she wears many hats, but one of the most important things I think people who are in the rights business is she's now the new president of the Habitat International Coalition, which has been central to a whole range of debates that I've seen at least for the last more than 35 years. So that's a fantastic new role, and we're glad that Adriana is taking that on. I don't know how it's going to play out in her academic and other life, but and both of us co-lead a critical component of the No program, which is looking at pedagogy. That's the reason I guess that both of us are sitting on this. To my right is Chandrika Bahadur, who also is a person who's been to many places and done many things, uh, including, believe it or not, helping manage the delivery of the part of the MDGs within the UN system after they were created a long time ago, in the last century. So life seems to move on in 2020, and subsequent to that has been centrally involved in trying to build the framework around the SDGs. She currently is the president of the STSN Association, more particularly to us, the SDG Academy, which for the last many years has been trying to reach a very significant target, and that is to have 1 million people who know something or many things about sustainable development and the SDGs. I think they're about halfway or about a third of the way onto that process. So essentially what she's built is a platform that has a tremendous amount of material through massive open online courses, now currently on edX, which touch pretty much all of the 17 SDGs. So this is a global platform, and it's connected with a whole range of different actors, because as we know, the world is very diverse, and she's managed to get the Chinese on board and people from the Arab speaking world and other languages to try and bring together a critical mass of both practitioners and people in educational institutions who can engage with the question of implementing this stuff. This is a very complicated framework with whatever it is, 17 goals and a whole range of targets. How does one try and operationalize that? So that's kind of the span of all of development, and she's been helping manage that. And the insights she brings from the struggle to get to 300,000, 400,000 learners, I think is very important for many of us, because many of us come from environments in which we're actually working in movements, or we're working in academic institutions, or we're working in public ones, where the kind of numbers that we're reaching out to at the most maybe in a lifetime in the tens of thousands. But here we're talking about things that are at a much larger scale, so there are a whole range of challenges and opportunities that come from that. And then finally, Professor Acharya, again a very old friend and colleague for many years. He's at the Center for Regional Development at India's famous university called Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's been witness to a whole lot of very interesting things over the last few weeks, apart from his own work over many years in Northeast India, which is an area which is deeply creative but also neglected. And Shravan is one of the few academics who's consistently been working on urban processes in Northeastern India, apart from his work all over the country earlier. He was earlier a professor at CEPT University in Gujarat, and led a program, very innovative program, in fact India's first program on climate. a master's program looking at climate. So he's not only a planner and somebody who works on development at large, but also has a whole, let's say, he's got generations of students who actually have engaged with questions of regional inequality and inequality in context quite significantly. So that's the panel in some senses. But before we sort of open up the discussion from the panel side, I thought a few reflections on some of the things that we've been trying to deal with here for many years, and also where we are in the world today. I mean, we started the session, or at least the opening plenary, looking at both structural questions within the global political economy and the institutions that we find are going through a whole range of crises across the world. And this is very, very marked in urban contexts across the world at the current point of time. In some senses, those of us who might even sort of remember it, this might actually be a 68 moment. So, in 68, at least in some parts of the world, there was an upsurge, especially coming from young people, from institutions who really question how the world was structured, how particular national economies and cultures were structured. And in some senses, the 68 generation, or in China, the 1976 generation, because that's the time that the Cultural Revolution is having in China, is a generation that's actually helping manage the world today. So that's an interesting reflection in some senses. So we have people who have come from that generation who really, at the moment, are helping manage either well or not so well parts of the world. So that's kind of one thing. But what I think may be useful to think about, and I went back when I was preparing for the session to an old piece of writing which used to be a favorite of mine a long time ago, and that's Freire's work. It's a slim book. Some of you may not have read it, and some of you may have read it many times, but The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's easy to read. You can find it on the net these days. He wrote it a long time back in 1970. And of course, he was in jail in the 60s. And people who study him are in jail today in Brazil. So I think it might be useful. Many of us are speaking from, I wouldn't say institutional positions, but positions that are close to institutions. And Freire put a lot of this stuff on its head in his work. And I guess one of the questions that we have in today's day and age, where, like I said, there are a whole range of changes that we've seen, starting with the protests in Arab Spring, this, that, the other across the world, where people are trying to make sense of their positionality within urban areas which are deeply unequal. So within the cities and urbanization itself, there are deep inequalities, and these inequalities in some senses have been the driver of the changes that we've seen within the neoliberal regime that we've seen in place for the last 20 or 30 years or so. We don't talk very much about regional inequality, but regional inequality is a very concrete reality in many parts of the world. So one scale up, the inequality between cities and regions, the challenge of in large countries like Brazil and India and Russia or whatever parts of Europe, etc., or even Nigeria, of trying to keep the balance between the so-called rural and urban. These sort of binary categories which create more problems in some sense that they solve. That's at one level. The second question that we don't often look at, and we've touched on this in many parts of the conversations here, and that is the exclusions that we practice in everyday life, which are absolutely real and are coming to the forefront of everything that we see, whether it's a mobilization or the changes or the new hegemonies that are coming to place. The exclusions around gender, around caste, around faith, around ethnicity, which are exceedingly becoming sort of forced today, partially because of, in some cases, a retreat of particular forms of states, and also the advance of other forms of sort of national construction. And this is something that we find across the world. So what I'm saying is, we know that there's inequality in cities, but some of this is deeply based on inequality at the functional level within individuals, and that's what Freire talks about. The idea of oppression and within quotes liberation is situated in the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed. And I think one of the questions that we really have to ask ourselves, given the situation that we find in many parts of the world today, is how much our educational systems have helped actually exacerbate that, deepen that, and in some senses are very much part of the crisis. All the institutions that we are part of. I mean, UCL, for example, was an institution that was created to be, at that point of time, and at its point of creation, was a liberative institution. It really reached out and tried to bring together and bridge a whole range of different divisions that, in a very different UK at that point of time, but it was very different from the existing institutional structures. And of course, it's tried to hold on to its mission, but, the institution and its mission and how society is are not separable in some senses. So the educational system, the kind of pedagogies that we contribute to and we practice are central to the outcomes that we see. We've seen this in South Africa over the last couple of years. Some of us have been almost witness to the roads must fall kind of movement there, which is then echoed in other places. In other parts of Africa, there was a situation when there were protests against Gandhi being present in some places. So these are things that people from India would actually be surprised at. So I guess the pedagogies that we help create, that we help transact, do come from positions of privilege in some senses. Whether the privilege comes from being an academic or an expert or somebody who's more experienced or educated, that privilege is quite strong. So I guess one of the questions I do want to ask is, if the world is actually looking at least shaking out of some of these older forms of, let's say, exclusion, how do we actually construct these processes? So we've been in IHS over the last many years trying to look at how we can bridge a whole range of these asymmetries, and I kind of list them one by one. I mean, the deepest asymmetry in some senses is the separation of human beings and nature, the material and the immaterial. That comes from something that gave a lot of impetus to the world as we know it today. It came from the Renaissance. Some parts of the world have not gone through the Renaissance, so they have the advantage of having not gone through it, but globalization has brought it to them. The separation of humans and nature is a deep and fundamental divide which sits at the basis of our epistemology in some senses, or at least the hegemonic epistemology that many of us are part of. The second one that's most obvious in a sense is the male-female binary. And in some senses, that's even deeper than the separation of humans and nature. It's deeper because patriarchy, in some senses, at least in some of our understandings, is the most significant form of oppression. So when we talk about pedagogy of the oppressed, that's the deepest and the oldest form of that engagement. And then, the power of the discipline. Disciplines give you tremendous power. They give you the ability to create the world that you have today. Much of what we see in the world that we have been given to us or have come out of the engagement around certain sets of disciplines. But the world as we experience it with 8 billion people almost is something that is inadequately captured by the disciplines that were created 300 or 400 years ago, even over the last 150 years, as we found the creation of the modern disciplines in some senses, the breakout from the canonical disciplines. So many of us have been trying to make sure that we have been trying to repair the fracture, and this is what the big attempts to create interdisciplinarity, the whole debates about transdisciplinary processes in some senses. So, that's the other fundamental fragmentation, provides tremendous power to science, to technology, to the natural sciences in some senses, deeply contested from other ways of looking at it. But the question, I guess, is how do you bring that back and in what context? Do you bring it back within a Western frame of pedagogy? Does it come through a form of critical engagement? Are there cultural forms in which it works? And this is my debate with many colleagues in China, that in some senses, a lot of Chinese academia is still now trying to reconstruct with Chinese characteristics frameworks that come from other places. Even though in their political life, in their social life, and maybe in their economic life, they have a very different tradition. And so and of course that comes from how the social sciences have emerged with respect to other kinds of things. And then the fourth or fifth thing, which I think is quite important for us here, is the fragmentation, which comes of course with disciplines, between theory and practice. Fine. That's an old debate. It's gone back a long time, but it's central to the way the world is organized today. In India, of course, we try and express it in somewhat more poetic terms. The fragmentation between the mind, the heart, and the hand. So even before Freire, one of Gandhi's experiments, in fact one of his great failed experiments, was something that he called Nai Talim, which he started off, in the last ashram that he set up in Varda, where they tried to bring this together in schools and for school children. It's a live pedagogy. We can show it, and there were a whole range of things. Basically, bring all of these things together. It was failed because as we industrialized, as we modernized in the 50s and 60s, and of course Gandhi was gone. That frame, in a sense, was completely lost to school education. But in some ways, this is one way of trying to heal many of the fractures that I've talked about between people and nature, between the masculine and the feminine, the earth and the sky in some senses, between the specialist and the integral in some sense. And then there's something else which I think the world has not had to deal with for a long time, but we have to deal with it today. The challenge between here and now and there and then. And what I'm saying, what I'm trying to say here is, we have never had a global civilization before. Right? We've never had a global civilization. We had many, cycles of processes of globalization, but we've never had a global civilization which is actually on the threshold, or it's crossed the threshold of the Anthropocene. The impact of this global civilization on natural systems now is so large and so definitive that it's coming back to upend a whole range of processes and many of the assumptions that we live with, whether it's our food systems or our water systems, or every system is actually infected by us. You can see that. I saw an article just yesterday about Arctic birds. You find in their droppings, you find plastics, microplastics. So the world is full of what we've created. The challenge of here and now is much of epistemic engagement, as I just separated the stuff. It's here or the afterlife, and we have a whole engagement around that, theology and a range of other things. And India is a great place. We have many philosophical traditions, but also the question of this place and other places. The fact is, all of these things are teleconnected just now. The reason that we're sitting in this building and we have all these wonderful lights here is we're actually taking sunlight that was captured maybe 150 million, 200 million years ago in coal. It's being burned, and it's coming back to us in seconds. Stuff that actually came together over centuries is coming back to us in seconds. So, time and space have been desperately compressed at the same point of time, and we're having to live that in our lifetime. That's what climate and global environmental change is, the compression of these processes. So there is a need for new pedagogies for this kind of new unknown processes. In a world in which action and reaction could be separate and you could have an industrial revolution, that doesn't exist anymore. Action, reaction and response have to come simultaneously. We have effectively maybe 20 years to address this question before it actually has dramatic impact on not just tens or, the Second World War can kill tens of millions of people. The climate and other impacts are going to impact hundreds of millions of people. So these fractures in some senses have to be healed. And I guess the core question is, who's going to heal it? Is it us who sit together and are privileged enough to talk like this? Is it wider discussion and a whole range of other process of people on the streets engaging with their everyday lives? Or can we set up a much more engaged process in which, and that's what Freire talks about, in which in some senses oppression is engaged with in everyday life. So in effect, the pedagogy is created by the process of upending that oppression. And we must recognize that in each one of us, we have both those elements. Like I said in the beginning, cities are places of great opportunity, but there's also the dark side, and we have to capture both and trying to sort of pull them together. So, our pedagogies are fairly important. We must recognize that there are deep epistemological inequalities in everything that we do. In our cultural life, in the choices we make about what we eat, the kind of people we meet, the kind of people that we bring into our families, the kind of societies that we create, both for ourselves and of course of others. Because the critical question just now is, who is the other? The bringing together of space and time effectively means there are no others. You can construct them for a while, but that will not hold. The physics and the chemistry and the sociology and all the other stuff, and our lived experience actually speaks to the fact that that doesn't hold. And if that doesn't hold, then we are in a sense asking to rework both the structure and fabric of our institutions, our lives, and even very basic ideas of what a city is, what a state is, what a nation is, because some of these ideas in some senses may have outlived their time. So I'll stop there and maybe ask Shravan to pick up and reflect on his experience over the last many years of trying to deal with these questions in a very concrete way in multiple institutions.
Thank you, Aro, and thank you, IHS, for inviting me here and giving me an opportunity to reflect. That is exactly the reason I didn't prepare PPT. I thought it would be better to reflect without a PPT. I think the mail which you wrote to me had three important words. One was urban, the other was inequality, and the third one was pedagogy. I think when one has to think about urban in the context, I'll be basically focusing in the context of South Asia and Asian countries. When you're talking about urban inequalities in the context of South Asia, I think we need to be very clear about one thing. It's not a binary between rural and urban. It is interconnected. That's the first thing I'd like to put it in the house. Because otherwise, our understanding of urban inequalities is going to be very, very incomplete. And there are processes and interactions, especially in a country like India, which still is around 71% rural. So the rural-urban interface is so strong, many of the inequalities that is embedded in the everyday lives of what you call as urban has to have some roots and links in the rural. So therefore, if you problematize this issue as if it is only an urban problem, then there will be a conceptual weakness in understanding this issue. Think of migrant construction. Very interesting in India, one of the major sources of the city GDP is real estate and construction. And who fuels that construction is basically the migrant rural workers. So this is one of the first things I would like to put it across and say that inequalities, urban, there are very specific types of inequalities and processes working in urban, but we need to also to contextualize in the context of rural in the case of India. That is one thing. The other thing is about inequality. I think it was discussed. Inequalities is basically about power relations. It is about resources. It is about institutional structures. It is about who owns the means of production and how it is distributed. It is a question of justice and access to resources. And it is very interesting. So when you are raising or discussing this issue of inequality, you are basically raising or asking questions to the powerful entity, maybe called a state. And in today's India, if you call or question the state, it is very easy to be labeled as urban Naxals. Of course, I don't want to put everything in a critical situation, but what I'm trying to put it at is that, so raising inequality question is difficult. So what does it mean to have a pedagogy? Therefore, if you are really, challenging the students, or if you are really challenging the resources, researchers, to question, this idea of inequality, your pedagogy has to be strong. Your pedagogy has to instill the skill amongst the student to have the ability and courage to question the state or the powers to be. Otherwise, what happens is And that is where the question of political economy comes in. Otherwise, what happens is that you will impart a pedagogic practices which is skill oriented. So you will basically create professionals who will deal the citizens as a client, or maybe the state as a client, and he just performs certain state sponsored responsibilities in exchange of some monetary gain or some commercial gain. But if your intention is to really question the inequality issues, the pedagogy has to be based on questioning the political economy of, or the genesis of that inequality, and that needs a different type of pedagogic practices. And in this context, I would just like to reflect based on my teaching experience. See, I taught in schools of planning for nearly 22 years. And now I am in a different university, which is always in the news for maybe asking these questions of inequality and justice. And let me just briefly tell you, both in the schools of planning, and I saw in the morning there were presentations, many of them on planning projects. In India, yes, the planning school does question inequality issues, maybe to access to land, access to housing, access to basic services. But many of the projects and the pedagogic approaches are very, very, what should I say, skill oriented. Many of our planning schools are still based on polytechnic models, which was basically a colonial legacy, because it was supposed to, solve a problem and give a straightforward answer to a problem, therefore very, very skill oriented exercise. So what happens is that in the planning schools, many of the questions related to inequalities doesn't address the political economic question. So what happens is that in the process, they don't address the fundamental issues which actually is the root cause of the problem. The other problem which I have seen as a teacher in the school of planning is the theoretical aspect, the theories that deals with inequalities are very, very weak. Because you have to be a professional, the more emphasis is given on skills. Maybe skills related to techniques, maybe skills related to collecting data. But the intensity of immersion in the real life projects is very, very limited. The immersion is based on what I call it as a very consultancy oriented approach. And those terms of references of those consultancies are dictated or determined by the state or whosoever is sponsoring that project. And interestingly, you will realize that because it is a very, very rational, very, very, an approach which tries and very hierarchic in a sense, that the students don't get an opportunity to reflect and move beyond the structure which is provided by the teacher to be, or the frames of the planning process which has been provided. So therefore, that is a limitation. Now I have moved from a planning school to a school which is or a university which is more liberal, and the tradition has been always to emphasize question and question the state. So what I found very interesting is that when you are asking the questions of inequality, I think the culture of the institution is very important. And when I say the culture of the institution, an institution which provides or provides opportunity for diversity. Diversity in not only in terms of thinking or in terms of approaching a problem, but diversity even in terms of, say for instance, the students or the faculty. I think universities, the current university which I am related to, because of the flexibility and the diversity which provides, the students, besides understanding in the classroom or in the theoretical context, they live the reality of inequalities or are trying to understand inequalities in the milieu or the environment of the university. So therefore, this whole debate about, public funded university which you are highlighting, I think the relevance of the public funded university in the context of addressing inequality issues in India and also the pedagogic approach is very important, because it is only the public university which provides, a platform for diverse group of students, income groups, and also diverse socioeconomic categories to come together and live that particular experience. So, unless the students have an opportunity to interact amongst each other, to understand each other, they will never ever understand the problems of inequality in the context of India. And this is one thing which I think is very, very important for us to understand. Like, pedagogy is not only about, having what type of technique that you teach, what type of delivery mechanisms that you have, how much immersion that you do in a field situation. Many of the planning projects have immersive studies program, take a project, But the point what I'm making is the culture of the institution should provide a platform for the students to understand the issues of inequalities amongst each other from their peer group. Then only the internalization of what you teach in the classroom, the theory, what you teach as a technique for them to understand, that becomes much more substantive. Otherwise, it is very, very superficial. And that is one of the reasons I found that, many of the planning students, when they are in the planning school, they are aware of inequality issues. But you will realize that when they complete school of planning, they don't pursue that particular course of activities or, professional activities in their life. Very few. Whereas students who come out from these liberal institutions, what I have found is their tendency to empathize and continue with issues of inequality, issues or working with organizations and the community is much more stronger. And that is mainly because their ability to sympathize, empathize, and also to learn about that particular issues of inequality is much more deep-rooted than in a professional institutes like the schools of planning. So I think this is one thing which I would like to highlight right now and say that inequalities needs to be embedded in the institutional culture. Just classroom teaching about theory, like say for instance, it is very, very fashionable to read Foucault, right? But I also know Foucault is very difficult. You just imagine a university, liberal university in India, there are students from rural India who haven't read English, To give you a text to him to read Foucault and then for him to conceptualize is so very difficult. But what I have also seen, the same student, if in the university there are protests, there are movements against the authority, what happens is that he internalizes those concepts because he sees things happening in the university. And that I say it because the university I come from is, the students are very actively politicized in some ways because they are always engaged in questioning the state. And therefore, the student who reads Foucault in the classroom, maybe if it is only theory, he will never understand. But when he goes to the street, he can reflect at least some of the concept, and his understanding becomes much more clearer. So I think I will end and say that the culture of the institution is very, very important in terms of what pedagogic practice that you evolve and impart to the students.
Thanks, Chavan. Chandrika is going to take this to another plane, but maybe make a connection, yeah? Because
yes,
you're a practitioner who needs many connections.
So thank you, Aro, and thank you everyone for being here at this hour. So my presentation will talk about something very different because, as Aro alluded to it, this is outside of a formal educational context. So when the STG Academy was set up in 2014, we had two briefs. One brief came from the UN system because the host organization that I'm part of, which is the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, is essentially a network of universities, about 1,200 right now around the world, set up by the UN. Now, the brief that came to us from the UN was around the time when the SDGs were being designed. And that brief was that what we don't want to do is to repeat the mistakes of the time that the Millennium Development Goals were designed, where they were seen very much as an internal UN process, and nobody in the world really knew very much about it. Whereas this time, both the process of design, but also afterwards, we want there to be a lot of closer or more distant?
More distant.
More distant, okay. We want there to be a lot more awareness as well as engagement with these concepts. So we want a large-scale awareness of what these issues are. So that was one brief that came to us. The second brief that came to us was from our member universities, and at that time there were about 100 odd. And they looked at the evolving agenda of the SDGs and essentially came back to us with one feedback, which is, this is too much for us to teach. We can do part of it. You know, we can do environment, but we know nothing about public health. Or we are an education school, but we know nothing about the environment. And so they said, we need resources that we can use to supplement what we are doing and how we're doing it. So when both of these requests came to us at the same time, we decided that we were going to address the first question by looking at scale, and the second question by looking at the network. And so that is really how the SDG Academy came about. What I want to show you is first a couple of what I call happy slides. Sorry, this is the second one. This is the first one. This is essentially the output. These are all the courses that we have produced so far. And as you will see, they cover almost all the SDGs, not all, but almost all. They've been produced over a period of about now 5 years. And they've been produced around the world. And talk a little bit about that, because there is one of the main issues around that we had to address very early is who is going to do the teaching, and I'll come back to that. The second happy picture that I want to show you is essentially some numbers, right? So this is happy because it shows a nice upward sloping graph, and this is what Aro was talking about, 350,000 people that we've reached so far. You see that we've reached almost every country in the world in terms of where our learners come from. We have a fairly broad split across, language, gender, qualifications. So it's a nice, diverse group. But of course, that's the happy story. So now we can turn this off now, and I'm going to talk about what's behind this this nice picture. And the first question I want to really put before you is, who do we consider learners, right? And especially in the context of inequality. There are the formal students in any education system that would be your first line of learners. And we addressed, and then there's the general public. And so, the idea of making sustainable development comprehensible, actionable, and part of consciousness of people around the world meant you had to go beyond the formal learners. And we've had a very different experience on both of these counts. So on one hand, we have these massive numbers, which is because we reach people directly. On the other hand, we also invited the universities in our network to use this material and see where that goes. And the difference is very stark, because we had a lot of interest from the universities, but the institutional structures of universities, the academic silos that professors are bound in, meant that the uptake, the translation from we're interested in material to we are actually using your material shrank from about 300 to 400 requests at any point of time to, I think this year we have about 25 universities that we're working with, which is a tiny proportion of our overall network. And we've always struggled. I mean, one of the things that my team complains about most is working with universities, because that's been incredibly hard to break through, despite intent and desire. So that's just an example to show you that when you are looking at scale, the formal structures actually are just ill-equipped to deal with that. So and to deal with any kind of non-traditional way of learning, because this required them to go to their academic committees to get permissions to teach material that hadn't been produced by the faculty, to do all sorts of things that the rules just simply either didn't allow or didn't exist for. So when we talk about who are the learners, for us, this has been a discovery process. When we put our material out there, we had no idea if anyone was going to be interested. Many of these courses are extremely dense. They're difficult. They're not vocational, so they don't teach you a skill, but they actually are talking about complicated issues. What has been very exciting for us, also humbling, is to see the range of people that have wanted to learn. So yes, your first, your usual suspects are students who want to supplement their knowledge. But almost half our learners are working professionals. So they're people who are in the field, who want to learn, who don't have access or don't have the time, and find material that they can use. So that's kind of the first lesson that we've learned. And I want to come back to this in the question in the context of the last 3 days here. When we're talking about inequality, and particularly urban inequality, who are the people we're talking about? And you mentioned the asymmetry, and you also mentioned the term asymmetry. There is fundamentally an asymmetry of knowledge and capacity that also drives inequality. And so if we're really looking at doing things differently, this knowledge has to be accessible to people who otherwise won't have access either to formal structures of education or any complicated way of getting access to knowledge, plus a support group that allows them to learn. And I want to give a very concrete example, because this is one of our best examples of how this information can be learned. We have a course in early childhood development. It's a wonderful course. It's part of it deals with the neuroscience of the brain and what we are learning about how children learn, and therefore why is it important to have early childhood programs and early care which will develop cognitive skills. So that's one half of the course, and the second half of the course is how to actually implement low-cost, effective systems of early childhood development in low-income settings. So those are the kind of two themes of the course. And we were contacted by Pratham, which is an NGO working in India on education, saying that we have a very large early childhood program and our team wants to learn this course, except they don't really understand English. So this is going to be a challenge. Do you have Hindi transcripts? And we didn't. So we said, we're really sorry, we don't. And then I didn't expect to hear back from them. I heard back from them after the course closed, saying that I think there were about 50 members of that team. All 50 had not only completed the course, but they had completed it with distinction. And the way they had done that was that they had formed WhatsApp groups where they helped each other learn. So where they would basically, every time as the course progressed, they formed their own little discussion groups. They related it to the work that they were doing. The ones who were more fluent in English explained to the others what they couldn't understand. And it was a collective learning effort. So now these are not, these are grassroots workers. So these are not people that they're not people who you would imagine would be a typical learner for a course like this. But they completed it, they're evangelists, they're urging everybody else to take the course, and for us it's a great example. But if we don't empower people who are actually on the ground, if we don't empower both communities, we talked a lot about empowerment in the last 3 days, but what does that mean? It's not just about making people aware of their rights, it's also giving them the tools and the knowledge that they can use and that they can build on to actually exercise that agency. And so that's a very essential part of it. So our understanding of the learner has changed quite dramatically. The second part of this is who is the faculty and where is knowledge produced. And that's another learning for us, because traditionally, again, institutions of higher education have been monopolies of knowledge and of knowledge creation and dissemination. And what teaching at scale allows us to do, and one of the things that has been most heartening for us to see, is that actually knowledge gets produced not in a unidirectional way, but it actually flows both ways. So the experience of our non-formal learners contributes right back to the knowledge that is going out from our faculty, and we have moved quite systematically from creating single faculty courses where it's one person talking for 10 weeks to multi-faculty courses. And the course that Aro produced here at Unsustainable Cities actually is a great example. It has about 20 plus, now nearly 30 faculty members from around the world. And what does that do? It actually allows us to reflect multiple perspectives on the same issue. And I cannot tell you how valuable that is, because we have a global audience. So it doesn't work for us if there's somebody sitting in Sweden who's telling somebody sitting in Bangladesh how they should think about a particular issue, particularly on the topic of sustainable development. It just doesn't work. So what we have now is people from different parts of the world giving their perspective on the same topic. So that's a very different way of learning, because then what the learner is getting is not just the knowledge, but multiple perspectives on that knowledge. So that helps them make up their own minds in a very different way from how it would be if they were just receiving it as if it were the truth, the absolute truth. So I think in terms of who the faculty is, that's been very important for us. And how have we done this? We've done this through partnerships, because there is no way a single institution can actually provide those multiple perspectives. So the fact that we do have 1,200 universities to draw upon has made a massive difference to the way we have been able to create and curate knowledge. So that's the second part. The third piece, and I will finish quickly, is when and how people learn is absolutely instrumental to how successful they are. So when you're a full-time student, that is your job. That's what you do, and you are in a fairly structured environment, so it's easy for you to do it. When you're working, or when you are, when you're an informal worker, you're a frontline community worker, you have a very stressful day. You have multiple demands on your time. And so flexibility becomes absolutely critical. You want to learn when you can. Many times you may decide you're going to learn in the evening, but you're just too tired, so you then save it up for the weekend, which is what a lot of our learners do. They'll spend 3 hours on a Saturday or a Sunday doing their portion of it, but they just don't have time in a structured way, so we have to give them that flexibility. You have to allow for cross-sectoral learning, and Aro talked a little bit about that. There are two aspects of this particular area of sustainable development, and I'm including the inequality work in this, that are critical. One is you have to go across disciplines. And again, very hard to do in an academic setting, though I know now lots of institutions are trying. But it's hard because these are not institutions that are set up for multi-sectoral learning. And the second is, very frankly, the field is evolving quickly. We actually are learning on a daily basis what climate change is going to do to us. Numbers are getting revised, our estimates are getting revised, how it affects people is something that we're learning. So finding ways of updating knowledge quickly becomes very important. And that's really why we used technology in the way we did. Now, technology is not the answer to everything, but what it does is it solves for some of these problems. It does allow flexibility. It allows fairly rapid updating of knowledge. it allows you to work across sectors and it allows you to work across institutions. And that's really been the benefit for us. And finally, I want to talk about access. When we're talking about inequality, and if we do want knowledge to reach across the board, there are three things we have to focus on. The first is infrastructure, and that's why the happy picture is not so happy, because yes, we have reached 193 countries, but if you delve a little bit deeper, our learners come from the United States, they come from the United Kingdom, and they come from India. These are the three countries that dominate our learner backgrounds. So yes, we'll have students from other countries, but they'll be a tiny fraction. The second issue is that even in middle and low income countries, the learners we get are the ones that actually can afford it, either in terms of the time they have or in terms of the cost of actually having high-speed internet, having a device, having the connectivity. So there is, it's a heavily skewed access based on country, based on infrastructure availability, as well as based on the purpose. So optional learning typically is a luxury that the rich can afford, right? So when you actually don't really care about credentialing, you are learning for the sake of knowledge, it's wonderful. You can do that when you have the time. But when you're pressed for resources, if you're going to invest in learning, you have to get something at the end of it. And if that something costs you, so right now our content is free, but we charge for certificates because that's the agreement we have with our online platform, and it's something that we debate every day internally. That is it okay? Because for somebody who's investing time from a country where they don't have resources and they use this as a way to get a better job or for it to be on their CV to show that they are skilled, they have to pay for it, which is unfair. So affordability is a big issue, and that's why we have put everything in the public domain as far as we can. But we're constantly haunted by what we can't put in the public domain, which is the credentialing. And the third part of it is language. We have a predominantly English-based pedagogy. We know that there are people who are taking our courses who struggle because they cannot learn the language. And we're making some attempts. We've tied up with a Chinese platform and an Arab platform so that we have greater diversity. But eventually, this material needs to be translated in the language in which people are comfortable, in which people think. So I would say the infrastructure, the affordability, and the linguistic access are probably the most important when we're trying to democratize knowledge. Let me stop there.
Thanks, Ansika. That was really useful, especially telling us about the other side of what the implementation. Just as a thought experiment, I think the provocation that Shravan gave us was, if you have an institution which has enough of the oppressed within it as learners, a culture that's supportive of that, and I think successfully this has happened for 40 years. Also, some of the learners come back and they become faculty. You're actually creating an explosive environment where that pedagogy of the oppressed can be actually implemented. If you take that and then you link it with this new ways of knowing and reaching out to people, and then you build that feedback from real life situations, either by people physically coming into that learning environment where this new knowledge which brings together all of these odd things and deals with these questions epistemically and otherwise, you actually have a very powerful model. The challenge, of course, is in the nature and the structure of the university. So actually building new forms of engagement where universities reach out, they restructure themselves, where in some senses the academic community completely retools themselves just like people in communities are doing every day to survive. That actually is, I think, would be a very, very powerful sort of way forward. And the 1200 are not in that spaces now, but I think even if 5 or 10 were able to do that, starting from a conversation in this place and be grounded. This is the big challenge that we're facing in dealing with anything to do with urban in many places. You need to build a sustainable relationship between local government, local communities, and that's been done with STI and other places, or UVA, but also with local academic and research institutions. Because if that churn doesn't take place, if you're not training and educating critically your next generation or you're not adding on to what's happening as practitioners in different places, you need that space for reflection. You need that place for this contest between different disciplines. That relationship at the local level is very weak in many parts of the world, and we're trying to do this, and we are succeeding and failing in many places. So that, in a sense, is the provocation that we have for colleagues from universities across the world. Work with the local governments, work with local communities, work with all those engagements, not to just do research and train consultants to go and do other stuff, but actually engage with knowledge creation, co-creation, co-production, and actually reworking the way that we actually do this stuff. So that's what you do. That's what you've done for 30 years. So that's a wonderful thing, to hand over to Adriana on some reflections on that. Yeah, I think so, because the mic. Yeah, because the technology needs it. You're live streaming just now.
Okay. I know how tired I am. I can what? Closer. Okay. So I just want to add another layer, as we don't have enough, but just taking a stock and definitely thanking my colleagues here and all of you for putting so many building blocks to build this enterprise of building a pedagogy of urban equality. I think that the first question is that we might ask ourselves is, why do we need a pedagogy of urban equality? And I'm not even going to talk about that, because I think that this is something that has been addressed again and again and again throughout the 3 days and very much in the previous presentations. But I think that I want to talk about a bit more other layers to what this might entail. What does it entail to build a pedagogy for urban equality, or rather pedagogies for urban equality? And the previous two speakers put two elements on that. So we might think well, actually is basically around thinking around our teaching techniques, pedagogic techniques, learning techniques, how we play, how we assembly, the content of what we teach, the content of the knowledge, and that definitely is a very important part of the equation. We also heard is an issue of thinking about accessibility to knowledge, better access in terms of how much it costs to go to the sites where knowledge is imparted upon others, in what language, etc., etc. But I want to add another proposition, which I think is even deeper, goes even deeper, which has to do with the idea that we do need to think about pedagogies not just as techniques in which we teach. Pedagogies can be as incapacitating, to use Arrow's language, as urban inequality. We know that pedagogies themselves reproduce inequality, not only because the content of what we are teaching or learning is inadequate, doesn't talk to reality, but because it has other pervasive, very, very pervasive effects. And today someone, I think it was Vanessa, with Catalina, Barbara and Emmanuel in a paper, put forward or reminded us of the notion of epistemic justice. And I thought, yes, that's really good to remember, to think about that notion. What is epistemic justice about? So a lot of us have heard about the work of Boaventura de Sousa Santos, where basically he says, well, actually we need an understanding of the world that exceeds by far the Western understanding of the world. And of course you can replace the Western understanding of the world with a patriarchal understanding of the world, with all the silences, deficits, and so on. So there is, of course, an argument about the fact that we do place the knowledge that counts, the knowledge that circulates with better or worse access, teaching techniques, and so on, fails to represent the world, and this is the complexity, the diversity of the world, and so on. There is a second proposition that he puts forward, and he says there is no chance for global social justice without global cognitive justice. There is no chance for global social justice without global cognitive justice. And let's take that to the city. So that means that unless we change the ways in which we know the city, we understand the city, and we understand how to affect change upon the city, there is not going to be justice. We will keep on tweaking, with some of the effects. Now, Of course, his third proposition that we know very well is the one that actually there are many other forms of knowledge that have to be valued around the world, and this has triggered a huge wave, and a very important wave of theorizing from other sides of theorizing, other parts of the world, other practices, and so on. But I think that there is someone else that might come to the rescue in this issue of thinking or building the skeleton or finding the roots for this pedagogy of urban equality. And I was thinking today about the work of Miranda Fricker. I don't know how many of you are familiar with her work, but and it happens very often that women are less cited than men, no, in their contributions. Miranda Fricker in 2007, so well before what I was talking about epistemic justice, she was the one that popularized the notion of epistemic injustice. And I just bring a couple of things that I think that are very, very useful that should put on the table. So what she said in her book, Epistemic Injustice, Power and the Ethics of Knowing, is more or less the following. She was arguing that there is a specific form of injustice that is performed when someone is wrong specifically in their capacity as a knower. Yeah? So you don't exist, you become invisible, you become stigmatized, you become excluded, and so on, because of something in your identity as a knower. Yeah? You know less. And this happens through a number of ways. And she put forward two ways in which this happens. And again, this starts to give us more tools to think about then what do we need to really tackle for a pedagogy of urban equality. She says, well, there are two ways in which epistemic injustice operates. One is what she calls, it happens through testimonial injustice, and the second, she talks about hermeneutical injustice. I want to translate in a second because it sounds, but it's quite simple what she said. So what she refers to testimonial injustice is referring to nothing else but the unfairness that is related to trusting someone's word. Yeah? You don't count, your experience doesn't count, you are, again, invisible. You are, and this is very, very commonly seen in process of stigmatization. So I would say that, for instance, it's obvious, but one thing that a pedagogy of urban equality needs to address is to be absolutely conscious of how to, on the one hand, dismantle the processes of stigmatization that we unwillingly reproduce all the time. Yeah? That as planners, as NGOs, as universities, and so on. This, if we think about the question of whose job this is, let's be clear, this is not the job of academics alone, this is not the job of universities, this is everybody's job. Wherever you are at risk of reproducing inequalities through your pedagogies, and you have the responsibility of doing something about that. So the second important point, so the first one, as I said, is testimonial injustice, the fact that you don't exist, so basically you are ignored, your point, your reality is ignored. You are a squatter, you are a migrant, we know, you are a woman, you are a single parent. How many identities qualify you for being ignored, for not having weight, authority, legitimacy, to have a testimony that counts? The second one, the idea of hermeneutical injustice, refers to how people interpret their own experiences, and whether there is anything or anybody, any institutional background that is going to listen to that interpretation of their own experiences. And this is very important. So for instance, let's think about an example. If we think about the notion of sexual harassment, that was coined only in the 70s. Yeah? So in the 60s, a woman or anybody else, but let's say mostly a woman, didn't have a chance to name it, to term it, what she was experiencing. In the 70s, she started to have that in some countries, in some contexts, and so on. But even in the 80s, she didn't have a chance to put that forward and get some response to that. So naming is not enough. Yeah? Terming is important. Giving a name to realities is important, and what names we use and where they help to stigmatize or destigmatize. But we also need to think about what is the way in which that naming really creates more capacities to change the way in which the oppressed, the other, and so on, can get justice, can be heard, can effect change. So I think that those two points are quite important, and if we were to turn them into the field of the creation of urban pedagogies or urban pedagogies, I would argue that we need urban pedagogies that open the possibility of describing and naming experiences that are invisibilized, silenced, or stigmatized. But also, we need pedagogies that guard and claim political spaces for those experiences to be interpreted and acted upon. And I think that very often, even when we talk a feminist perspective and intersectional perspective, we stop at the former. We stop at naming things, and naming things alone is not enough. I think that I might stop here, or perhaps I put just only 2 more questions or considerations we have to do with the the second one, I think that we get quite lost with the idea of talking so much about knowledge rather than action and learning. So all the time we talk about decolonizing knowledge, improving knowledge, diversifying knowledge, and so on. And we do get the sense that knowledge is a thing again, no? Like power. I think that I can give to you, you can have more or less of that, it can be diversified and so on. I mean, we know Foucault made that point a long time ago. Okay? Knowledge is not the thing, it's the person and so on. But we do too much with knowledge as a thing rather than a process. And it's extraordinary because if we keep on trying or relying so much in the construction of pedagogy, in the notion of perfecting the knowledge, transmitting knowledge in a better way and so on, we unlock in a way and in a word of epistemic issues. We are never going to change that. So that's an important thing that we need to resist that tendency. I'm not saying that we don't need knowledge, but it's much more around the production of that knowledge, the circulation of that knowledge, and so on, the content of that knowledge that we have to think about. A third point is, where do we do this? And I think that very often we think about the pedagogies of others. And this is exactly the opposite of what Freire and the field of critical pedagogy says. The field of critical pedagogy says you can only become a critical pedagogue if you start at home, if you start on your own practice. So we can do that wherever we are, but we have to think about what are the constraints and what are the conditions, the knowledge, the ways of learning the world that we are willingly or unwillingly reproducing that have to do with where we work. And believe me, these constraints don't only live in universities. We have been talking a lot about that. It's very easy to see the political economy of a university and how oppressive it is, in the fees, in the formal process and so on. But I have seen the same process of oppression through pedagogies that are incapacitating being reproduced everywhere. Yeah? Again, unwillingly, by NGOs, even by CBOs, even by communities themselves. So we need to think about that. My last point. We tend to talk about the idea of a pedagogy in a very lofty way, for urban equality and so on, as an intended consequence, outcome. This is something that we want to happen in anything that we do. And I was thinking, recently we were reading with Julia an article that was very interesting. That was a study that was looking at the work of critical pedagogues. And what the study found, not in the field of urban planning, it had nothing to do with cities, but what the study found that across many, many fields, self-proclaimed critical pedagogues do anything, practice anything but critical pedagogy. They are in fact very much adhering, reproducing the banking education system and so on. So the intention very often doesn't travel, and what we need to do is to look very critically our practice. And so I think that the idea of not so much theorizing about pedagogy, but thinking of the theory, if you wish, or theorization that emerges for practice pedagogies. We need to learn from how we are practicing pedagogies. And again, this is not just how we are helping the development of certain skills. This is something much more deeper. We need to think about the unintended consequences and also the unwanted outcomes. And I think that there is something interesting there because we keep on thinking that the unwanted outcomes of the pedagogies that we practice, wherever we are usually something that has nothing to do with us, and nothing to do with what we do. Part of it is true. Part of it might have to do with the political environment in which we work. But that gives us a responsibility to think how we're going to engage with more insertion practices within the political environment in which we work. And that might mean, for instance, thinking about, as we were hearing this afternoon, particular ways of treating the notion of ethics and ethical work. So if you work in a university, filling in a form, having ethical consent and so on, might do nothing to guarantee that you are really engaging with an ethical practice. And the same is true in many other contexts. Now, there is also the issue of the unwanted outcomes that are absolutely easy to foresee. And so that we work with a lot of devices in our everyday that will definitely take us to one unwanted outcome. And one that was mentioned, there will be many, but one that was mentioned repeatedly throughout the conference was that of our reliance on the project. No? We work through projects, and then on the other hand, we talk about how change and deep change and change that challenges urban equality and injustice and so on requires a slow, requires a long-term process and so on. While we do exactly the opposite, we work in a fragmented way through very short devices which are very output driven, which are very responsive, not to the reality that we are likely to find, but to the content, etc., etc. Again, this is not only something that happens to researchers, happens to NGOs, happens to everybody. We are completely projectualized. So perhaps one of the first things that we have to do is to think about that. It's not the only one. Many more things. I'm probably going to stop here because I'm sure you are very, very tired, and it would be wonderful also to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you. So I know it's a long evening, but one more provocation to the audience so that you can really take my colleagues on here. And that is, Adrian described both the process and articulated how one could construct and build on, a more equal pedagogy. I would try and provoke you with a counterfactual, a very live counterfactual. In this country, we, like Ratan said in the beginning, we talked about a museum of inequality. We have developed for a few millennia one of the most effective systems of institutionalizing and reproducing inequality. And we do it in very simple ways, very practical ways, so practical that they are almost invisible and hence impossible to counter in the way that you talked about. And what are the 4 ways? The first thing, of course, we know about, by making people invisible. And that's true of all places. We've talked about that. The second way, which is the second part of that, is when they're no longer invisible, you make them untouchable. And for people who work in space, this is very critical. It means that you cannot come within your space, whether it is to eat or to participate or a particular period of a month as far as women are concerned, etc. So that's the second. So basically, invisibility and untouchability. The second thing is you prohibit the practice of professions that allow the upturning of inequality, which means that you can never be a teacher, you can never be a critical learner, and that's part of the social contract. To add to that, you make sure that the people who are invisible, untouchable, and who cannot practice the professions that can enable freedom cannot own anything. Because by owning modes of production or capital or even knowledge, they can actually break out of that cycle. But finally, and that's what the most critical thing is, if by accident you happen to hear the wonderful things that we're talking about here, the punishment is to put burning oil into your ear, because you cannot hear, you cannot participate in the creation of knowledge. I'm translating from various different documents and other processes, but this is basically you cannot participate in the creation of these knowledges, you cannot be critical. So it's a system that is very stable, I would say ultra stable in some senses, and upending it means that you have to attract it at each of these levels to make it possible, to do what we're talking about, institutionally, personally, in society, and in the kind of knowledges that you create. So anyway, that was a strong provocation, but I thought, maybe that's a way to get back at our colleagues here, respond to that. Questions, responses?
Hello, everyone. It's great to be part of this discussion, and it's not a question, but the fact and reality. We are talking about creating platform or opportunities for young generation, which gives them opportunities to develop and learn, basically liberal education. But the fact is, inequality is already generated at very young age of the today's generation, and today's world is very advanced. Since last 15-20 years, lot of advanced developments are happening, and very less percentage of this world is exposed to that advancement. Most of these young generations are not exposed or don't get exposure because of their economic conditions. So for example, today's schools, private schools, they have high fees, and only higher economical people with higher economical conditions can only afford to send their children to those schools, and those schools give lot of opportunities and lot of exposure, whereas other children are still away from that kind of exposure. So when we are talking about conditioning them at their age of 20 or in late 20s, probably it becomes difficult because already they are conditioned at their younger age. That's just a thought.
Early childhood and beyond. Any other reflections, any questions, any responses to the panel? Or do you all want to become reflexive academics and practitioners? And Karen. Happy note.
I don't have too much, it's not profound, but I do believe that if you want to make the challenges we're talking about and you want to make the changes we're talking about to address inequality, we can be totally overwhelmed by the size of the problems. I mean, we can talk about them endlessly, unfortunately. What we need is inspiration. And I know that's not so helpful, but I also know that without it, nothing will change. And we need to look for inspiration, and we need to generate it in our work, in our teaching. And I suppose some of those self-reflexive processes can be inspirational, but they should be inspirational rather than beating us up. Because a critique and a criticism of oneself that beats you up doesn't leave much room for inspiration. And so I don't know how you create it exactly, and maybe we can talk about that, but I think without hope and without inspiration, those changes won't happen. And so I'd rather end this wonderful 3 days together on a note of hope and inspiration than an overwhelming feeling that, how do we move forward given the size of the problem?
Thank you, Karen. I think, that's what we started with. Cities provide us a space. All the most significant struggles and transformations that we've seen in the last 250 years have been born out of urban contexts, slavery, emancipation, all of those processes pretty much across the world, including in this country. The challenge, of course, is in a world in which more people are connected to stuff. How does one actually do that? And I think we've got so many wonderful examples around the room. That's what the last 3 days have been about, really. Examples of small things, if they were connected up and people build the partnerships and created the right institutional cultures and set up the processes and are able to call out these questions. That's why I went to the downer, because you have to call out the facts. These are social facts. If you're able to put this stuff together, that's what I guess our calling is, at least most of the people in this room. So if people are willing to kind of go back and start doing this stuff, maybe we should close this now. Good. No more questions, no more responses. Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful 3 days. And thanks to many of our colleagues and friends who made this possible. So, yeah.
I would like to thank just for creating this space for everybody. Each year they do it, and each year it brings enormous debates and discussions which are extremely relevant, extremely important. And on behalf of the Loan team here, I would also like to thank you for that opportunity for giving us spaces and to share some of the work we're doing. And we really, long may you thrive.
Long may us all thrive. Thank you. Good night, and yeah, have a wonderful evening, and yeah, keep up the struggle.
Thank you.